Sarah Martinez wiped the grease from her hands as the last helicopter of the day touched down at Forward Operating Base Wolverine. The dust cloud kicked up by the rotor wash made her squint, but she was already moving toward the aircraft before the engines fully wound down. As the lead mechanic for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems just by listening to how an engine sounded during landing. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson, climbed out of the cockpit, shaking his head. Sarah could see the frustration written across his weathered face even before he spoke. "She's running rough again, Martinez. Started about 20 minutes into the flight. Same vibration we talked about last week." Sarah nodded, pulling her long black hair back into a ponytail as she approached the MH-60 Blackhawk. The helicopter looked perfect from the outside, its dark green paint scheme blending into the Afghan twilight, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had been working on rotorcraft for 8 years, first in the regular army, and now with the elite Night Stalkers. Her grandfather had been a mechanic in World War II, and her father had worked on cars his entire life. Some people joked that she had motor oil running through her veins instead of blood. "Let me take a look," she said, already reaching for her toolkit. The base around them buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for evening operations. Afghanistan's Helmand province was never truly quiet, but there was something different about tonight. Sarah could feel the tension in the air, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what was causing it. As she began her inspection, Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with her younger brother Miguel just that morning over satellite phone. He was finishing his senior year of high school back in El Paso, Texas, and had been accepted to study engineering at the University of Texas. Their parents were so proud, constantly bragging to neighbors about their son who was going to be an engineer. Meanwhile, Sarah was the daughter who had enlisted instead of going to college, who worked with her hands instead of pursuing a respectable career. "Find anything yet?" Thompson asked, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah ran her fingers along the transmission housing, feeling for unusual heat or vibration patterns. Her hands were small but strong, calloused from years of working with tools and machinery. She had learned early in her career that in a male-dominated field, she had to be twice as good as everyone else just to be taken seriously. It hadn't been easy, but she had earned the respect of every pilot and crew chief on the base through her skill and dedication. "Give me a few more minutes," she replied, pulling out her stethoscope. Most mechanics relied on computerized diagnostic equipment, but Sarah trusted her senses more than any machine. She listened carefully to the transmission, moving the stethoscope to different positions while Thompson ran the engines at various power settings. There it was, a subtle grinding noise that most people would never notice, buried underneath the normal operating sounds of the aircraft. Sarah frowned, recognizing the sound immediately. It was a bearing starting to fail, but the location was unusual. This particular bearing rarely gave problems, and when it did, the symptoms were usually much more obvious. "Shut her down," Sarah called to Thompson. "I need to pull some panels." As the engines wound down, Sarah noticed a group of soldiers jogging past in full combat gear. Their equipment looked different from the regular Army units stationed at the base. These men carried specialized weapons and moved with the controlled urgency that marked them as Special Operations Forces. She had seen enough of these units come and go to recognize the signs. "Busy night ahead," Thompson commented, following her gaze. "Word is there's a big operation going down, multiple teams deploying." Sarah nodded but focused on her work. Her job was to keep the aircraft flying, not to worry about what missions they would be supporting. She removed several access panels and shined her flashlight into the transmission housing. What she saw made her stomach drop. The bearing wasn't just failing, it was completely destroyed. Metal fragments were scattered throughout the transmission case, and the oil was contaminated with debris. This helicopter wasn't going anywhere tonight, or probably for the next several days while she waited for parts and completed a complete transmission rebuild. "How bad is it?" Thompson asked, reading the expression on her face. "She's grounded," Sarah said, straightening up and wiping her hands again. "Transmission bearing failure. It's going to take at least a week to get the parts and do the rebuild properly." Thompson cursed under his breath. "That's going to leave the squadron short for tonight's mission. Command isn't going to be happy about this." Sarah felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. It wasn't her fault that the bearing had failed, but she knew that some people would still find a way to blame the maintenance crew. She had seen it happen before, especially when high-priority missions were affected. The pressure to get aircraft back in the air quickly was enormous, but Sarah refused to compromise on safety. Too many good people had died because someone had cut corners on maintenance. "I'll work through the night to get started on the rebuild," she offered. "Maybe I can shave a day or two off the timeline if I can get the parts expedited." Thompson nodded, but Sarah could see he was already thinking about how to explain the situation to his commanding officer. As the pilot walked away toward the operations center, Sarah began the process of properly grounding the aircraft and ordering the necessary parts. The base grew busier as the evening progressed. Sarah watched teams of soldiers loading equipment onto the remaining helicopters, their movements sharp and focused. She recognized the pre-mission energy, the way everyone moved with purpose, but also with the underlying tension of knowing they were heading into danger. Around midnight, as Sarah was finishing her paperwork for the grounded aircraft, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopters departing. She looked up to see several Black Hawks and an MH-47 Chinook lifting off into the darkness, their lights quickly disappearing into the Afghan night. Whatever mission they were supporting, it was significant enough to require multiple aircraft and what looked like at least 2 different special operations units. Sarah returned to her work, unaware that in just a few hours, her quiet life as a mechanic would be turned completely upside down. The mission she had just watched depart would go horribly wrong, and the skills that had made her an exceptional aircraft mechanic would be the only thing standing between life and death for some of America's most elite warriors. The last thing Sarah remembered before exhaustion finally forced her to catch a few hours of sleep was the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the valley. It was common enough in Afghanistan that most people on the base barely noticed it anymore, but something about these particular shots made Sarah pause and listen more carefully before finally heading to her bunk. Sarah was awakened at 0430 hours by the sound of her bunk room door slamming open. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the maintenance chief, stood silhouetted in the doorway with an expression she had never seen before. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. "Martinez, get up! Now! Grab your gear and meet me at the flight line in 5 minutes." His voice was tight, clipped. Sarah sat up immediately, years of military training overriding her confusion. "What's the situation, Sergeant?" "Just move. I'll explain on the way." Sarah pulled on her uniform and boots, grabbed her toolkit and personal weapon, then jogged toward the flight line. The base was alive with activity despite the early hour. Emergency vehicles were racing between buildings, and she could see medical personnel setting up triage areas near the landing pads. Rodriguez was waiting beside a Humvee, its engine already running. As soon as Sarah climbed in, he gunned the engine toward the far end of the airfield, where she could see a single helicopter sitting alone on the tarmac. "The mission went bad," Rodriguez said without preamble as they drove. "Real bad. 2 teams inserted 12 hours ago to take out a high-value target in the mountains. Intel said it was supposed to be a quick in-and-out operation." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What happened? Ambush. Someone leaked the mission details. The teams walked into a kill zone with at least 40 hostiles waiting for them. Both helicopters were shot down trying to extract the survivors. The Humvee skidded to a stop next to the lone helicopter, and Sarah could see why they had woken her up. It was the same model MH-60 she had been working on the day before, but this one looked like it had been through hell. Bullet holes stitched across the fuselage, one of the engines was smoking, and hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple locations. "This bird made it back on fumes and a prayer," Rodriguez explained as they climbed out. "Pilot says she's got maybe one more flight left in her before she comes apart completely. Maybe." Sarah walked around the aircraft, her trained eye cataloging the damage. It was extensive, but she had seen worse. The real question was whether they could keep it flying long enough for whatever Mission Command was planning. "Where are the teams now?" she asked, running her hand along a particularly nasty bullet hole that had just missed the main rotor hub. "Holed up in a compound about 40 kilometers north of here. They've got wounded, limited ammo, and hostile forces closing in from 3 sides. Weather's too bad for close air support, and this is the only bird we've got that might be able to reach them." Chief Warrant Officer Amanda Chen emerged from the pilot's seat, her flight suit stained with oil and blood. Sarah had worked with Chen before and respected her abilities, but the pilot looked shaken. "Martinez, thank God," Chen said. "I need you to tell me honestly whether this aircraft can make one more round trip. The boys on the ground don't have much time." Sarah began a rapid but thorough inspection, crawling under the aircraft and pulling access panels. The damage was worse than she had initially thought. The hydraulic system was barely functional. One engine had taken shrapnel that would normally ground the aircraft immediately, and the transmission was showing signs of stress from the violent maneuvers Chen had performed during the escape. "How much weight are you planning to carry?" Sarah asked. 12 survivors, plus whatever crew I can fit. We're talking about overloading her by at least 2,000 pounds. Sarah did the calculations in her head. Under normal circumstances, she would ground this aircraft without hesitation. The risk of catastrophic failure was enormous, especially with the added stress of an overloaded condition. But 12 American soldiers were going to die if this helicopter didn't fly. "I can patch the hydraulics and bypass some of the damaged systems," Sarah said finally. "But I can't fix everything, and I can't guarantee how long the repairs will hold." "How long do you need?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah looked at the aircraft again, running through the repair sequence in her mind. 4 hours minimum, maybe 6 to do it right. Rodriguez's face fell. "Intelligence says the hostiles will overrun their position within 3 hours. We don't have 6 hours. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. 12 men were going to die because she couldn't fix a helicopter fast enough. She thought about her grandfather's stories from World War II, about mechanics working around the clock to keep aircraft flying during the darkest days of the war. "There might be another option," Sarah said slowly. "But it's risky as hell." "What are you thinking?" Chen asked. "I go with you. Bring my tools and repair the aircraft on site while you extract the survivors. I can patch the worst problems during the flight and make emergency repairs once we're on the ground. It's not standard procedure, but it might work." Rodriguez immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not. You're a mechanic, not infantry. That compound is surrounded by hostiles." "I know weapons," Sarah argued. "I qualified expert marksman last time we tested, and I'm the only person on this base who knows this aircraft well enough to keep it flying under combat conditions." Chen was studying Sarah with the calculating look of a pilot weighing impossible odds. "Could you really repair enough systems during flight to keep us airborne?" "Some of them, yes. The hydraulics I can bypass manually if I have to. The engine damage I can monitor and hopefully prevent from getting worse. But I'll need access to the transmission and flight controls during the entire flight." Rodriguez looked between Sarah and Chen, clearly torn between military protocol and the reality of the situation. Finally, he keyed his radio. "Operations, this is Rodriguez. I need to speak with the colonel immediately." The next 30 minutes were a blur of heated radio conversations, hastily drawn maps, and equipment gathering. Sarah found herself assembling a kit of emergency repair tools while trying not to think too hard about what she was volunteering to do. She had never been in combat, had never fired her weapon at another human being, and had certainly never attempted to repair a helicopter while under enemy fire. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, arrived at the flight line with a grim expression. He listened to Chen's assessment of the aircraft's condition and Sarah's proposed solution, then studied both women for a long moment. "This is completely outside normal operating procedures," he said finally. "If something goes wrong, I'm sending a mechanic into a combat zone with no backup and no training for this kind of mission." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, "something has already gone wrong. 12 men are going to die if we don't try this." The colonel looked at the damaged helicopter, then at the intelligence reports coming in from the trapped teams. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Hostile forces were moving into position for a final assault, and weather conditions were preventing any other form of support. "Do it," he said finally, "but I want a full combat load for Martinez. Body armor, helmet, extra ammunition. And Chen, you stick to the extraction plan exactly as briefed. Get in, get the survivors, and get out. No heroics." As Sarah struggled into unfamiliar body armor and checked her weapon one final time, she caught sight of herself in the helicopter's window. The reflection showed a young woman who looked scared but determined. Someone who was about to attempt something that would either save 12 lives or add one more casualty to the growing list. The last thing Sarah heard before they lifted off into the gray Afghan dawn was Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "Good luck, Martinez! Bring them home!" As the damaged helicopter struggled to gain altitude, Sarah was already at work with her tools, racing against time and mechanical failure to keep the aircraft flying long enough to reach the men who were counting on them. Behind them, the base disappeared into the morning haze, and ahead lay 40 kilometers of hostile territory and an uncertain fate. The helicopter shuddered violently as they approached the landing zone, and Sarah felt her stomach drop along with the aircraft's altitude. She had been working frantically during the entire 40-minute flight, jury-rigging hydraulic bypasses and monitoring engine temperatures that kept climbing into the danger zone. Her hands were cramped from gripping tools while the helicopter bucked and rolled through the turbulent mountain air. 2 minutes out," Chen announced over the intercom, her voice tight with concentration. "I can see smoke rising from the compound. Looks like they're still taking fire." Sarah peered through the bullet-scarred window and saw the isolated compound below. It was a typical Afghan structure, mud brick walls surrounding a central courtyard, but it looked like a war zone. Bullet impacts pocked the walls, and she could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills where enemy fighters had taken positions. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully," Chen said. "The landing zone is hot. We're going to take fire the moment we start our approach. I need you to keep this bird flying no matter what happens." Sarah nodded, even though Chen couldn't see her. She had replaced her tool belt with ammunition pouches, and her M4 rifle was slung across her back, but she knew her real weapon was her knowledge of this aircraft. Without her constant attention to the failing systems, they would never make it back to base. The helicopter lurched suddenly as Chen began the approach, and Sarah heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire over the engine noise. Bullets began striking the fuselage with metallic pings, and she instinctively ducked while continuing to monitor the engine gauges. "Taking fire from multiple positions," Chen reported. "I count at least 20 muzzle flashes in the tree line to the east." Sarah's hands moved automatically across the manual controls she had rigged to bypass the damaged hydraulic systems. The aircraft was responding sluggishly, and she could feel the vibration in the airframe that indicated they were very close to a catastrophic mechanical failure. The helicopter touched down hard in the compound's courtyard, and Sarah immediately saw American soldiers running toward them from defensive positions around the walls. Several were carrying wounded comrades, and she could see the exhaustion and desperation in their faces. "Martinez!" a voice shouted over the engine noise. "We need help with the wounded!" Sarah looked toward the voice and saw a Navy SEAL she didn't recognize, his uniform torn and blood-stained. But as she started to move toward the cabin door to help with the casualties, the aircraft's engine temperature alarm began screaming. "Chen, we've got engine overheat," Sarah called into her headset. "If that engine seizes, we're not going anywhere." "How long can you keep it running?" Chen asked. Sarah studied the gauges, doing rapid calculations in her head. The engine was running well beyond safe parameters, and the cooling system had been damaged by enemy fire during their approach. She could shut down the engine to let it cool, but that would leave them on the ground much longer than planned. "Maybe 10 minutes before it completely fails," she said, "but I can try to cool it down if you give me 3 minutes." "You've got 2, Chen replied. "Enemy reinforcements are moving in from the north. We need to be airborne before they get into rocket range." Sarah grabbed her tools and dropped out of the aircraft, immediately feeling the heat from the overworked engine washing over her. Bullets were still striking the compound walls around them, but she forced herself to focus on the mechanical problem in front of her. She popped the engine cowling and was greeted by the sight of coolant lines that had been severed by shrapnel. The engine block was glowing red hot, and she knew they had minutes at most before permanent damage occurred. "I need wire and clamps," she shouted to the nearest SEAL, a young corpsman who was loading a wounded soldier into the helicopter. "What kind of wire?" he asked, not stopping his work. "Anything metal. Comm wire, fence wire, whatever you can find." As Sarah worked to repair the cooling lines, she became aware of the larger battle happening around her. The compound's defenders were running low on ammunition, and enemy fighters were moving closer under cover of the surrounding trees. She could hear automatic weapons fire getting louder and more frequent. "Sarah, we need to go now," Chen's voice crackled in her earpiece. "I've got movement in the trees. Looks like they're setting up for a final assault." Sarah twisted the last wire connection into place and felt coolant beginning to flow through the improvised repair. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't last long, but it might be enough to get them home. "Engine cooling down," she reported, slamming the cowling closed. "But this repair won't hold for more than 30 minutes. She climbed back into the aircraft and saw that all 12 survivors were now aboard, packed into every available space. Some were wounded seriously enough that she wondered if they would survive the flight, but at least they now had a chance. "Everyone's aboard," the SEAL team leader reported, "but we've got a problem. Intel was wrong about enemy strength. We count at least 40 hostiles moving into assault positions. They've got RPGs, and they're going to hit us the moment we lift off." Sarah felt her mouth go dry. 40 enemies with rocket-propelled grenades could destroy the helicopter before they even cleared the compound walls. She looked around the cramped cabin at the faces of the men they had come to rescue, saw the hope mixed with fear in their eyes. "There has to be something we can do," she said. The team leader, whose name tape read Jackson, shook his head grimly. "Not with the weapons we have left. We're down to our last magazines and half the team is wounded. Those RPGs will tear us apart." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities, thinking about the aircraft's capabilities and the tactical situation they were facing. Then she remembered something from her technical training, a capability that wasn't normally used in this type of mission. "Chen, does this bird still have the external cargo hook installed?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, but what good is that going to do us?" Sarah was already moving toward the cargo area, pulling out the coiled steel cable that connected to the helicopter's belly hook. Her plan was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was the only option she could think of. "There's a fuel truck parked behind the compound," she explained rapidly. "If I can hook that truck and carry it over the enemy positions, then drop it at the right moment." Jackson stared at her like she had lost her mind. "You want to drop a fuel truck on them?" "It's 1,500 gallons of diesel fuel," Sarah said. "If I can get it positioned correctly and detonate it somehow, it'll take out their RPG positions and give us clear airspace to escape." Chen's voice came over the intercom. "Sarah, That's insane. The weight of that truck will put us way over maximum lift capacity with all these people aboard. Only for about 30 seconds, Sarah argued. Just long enough to position it and drop it. This aircraft can handle that much stress for a short time, especially if I can keep the engines running at maximum power. She was already connecting the cargo hook cable, her hands moving with the precision that came from years of training. Around her, the sound of incoming fire was getting more intense as enemy forces closed in on the compound. "Movement in the north tree line," one of the SEALs called out. "They're getting ready to rush us." Jackson made a command decision. "Do it," he told Sarah. "But if this doesn't work, we're all dead." Sarah dropped out of the aircraft one final time and sprinted toward the fuel truck, which sat behind the compound's main building. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet as she ran, and she could hear enemy fighters shouting to each other in Dari as they coordinated their assault. The truck's engine started immediately, and Sarah thanked whatever higher power looked after desperate mechanics. She drove the vehicle directly under the helicopter's hook point, jumped out, and secured the cable to the truck's frame with the fastest tie-down job of her career. "Hook attached," she reported, running back toward the helicopter. "But Chen, you need to know that truck's center of gravity is all wrong. It's going to swing like crazy once we lift off." "Roger that. Everyone hold on." The helicopter struggled to lift off with the massive external load, its engines screaming at maximum power. Sarah monitored every gauge and control system, making constant adjustments to keep them airborne. The fuel truck swung wildly beneath them as Chen fought to control their flight path. Below them, Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from the tree lines as all 40 enemy fighters opened fire at once. Tracer rounds streaked past the windows, and she heard the distinctive whoosh of RPGs being fired. "RPG, 2 o'clock!" Jackson shouted. Chen threw the helicopter into a violent turn, and the fuel truck's momentum carried it directly over the largest concentration of enemy fighters. Sarah reached for the cargo release handle, timing the drop based on her mental calculations of the truck's swing pattern and the enemy positions below. "Dropping now," she called, pulling the release. The helicopter shot upward suddenly, freed from the massive weight, just as the fuel truck crashed into the tree line below. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire mountainside erupted in flame as the diesel fuel ignited, creating a fireball that could be seen for kilometers. The explosion eliminated the RPG threat and scattered the remaining enemy forces, giving Chen the clear airspace she needed to begin the flight back to base. But Sarah's attention was already focused on the aircraft systems, which were showing signs of severe stress from their desperate maneuver. As they flew through the Afghan morning toward safety, Sarah worked frantically to keep the engines running and the flight controls responding. The improvised repairs were failing one by one, and she knew they were in a race between mechanical failure and the distance remaining to base. 30 minutes later, as the helicopter made an emergency landing at Forward Operating Base Wolverine, with both engines on the verge of complete failure, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe they had made it. 12 American soldiers were alive because a mechanic from El Paso had refused to accept that a mission was impossible. As medical personnel rushed to treat the wounded and debrief the rescued teams, Sarah sat quietly beside the destroyed helicopter, her hands still shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. She had volunteered to fix a broken aircraft and somehow found herself in the middle of a combat rescue that would be talked about for years to come. Colonel Harrison found her there an hour later, still covered in oil and hydraulic fluid, staring at the aircraft that had given everything it had to bring everyone home. "Martinez," he said simply. "Well done." Sarah nodded, thinking about her brother Miguel and his college acceptance letter, about her parents who had always wanted her to pursue a more traditional career. She realized that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with knowledge, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for the lives of others.